Alrighty then, let's get this party started. We're going to go out to the Oracle Technology Network website. If you do a Google or Bing search for Oracle Database 12c downloads, you'll come to this page. And what you'll want to do is first accept the license agreement. It tells you thank you. You'll see also in the top I've logged in. I've created my Oracle Technology Network free account. Sign in, sign out, all those controls are pretty intuitive. We want to come down to the appropriate release, which as of this recording is Database 12c Release 1. And you see we have our list of supported operating systems: Windows, Oracle Linux, or just generic Linux really, Solaris, HPUX, AIX, and XLinux. I'm going to do Windows, and I'll want to go to See All. You can download the files directly, but that's just for the database. We want to go to See All, and if I scroll down just a little bit, again, I'll have to accept the license agreement. We have Oracle Database 12c Release 1 Grid Infrastructure, and then you just download the zip files for the appropriate operating system that you're using. I've done that for you here, and then I've actually extracted them to a folder. In that folder, we have a folder called Grid, and in there we have setup.exe. Now, on Linux systems, you don't have exe files. Instead, you'll have a file called runinstaller.sh, and you just invoke that from a terminal shell prompt. There's also another tool, again on Linux, this is a shell script. On Windows, it's a bat file called runcluvfy, run cluster verify. This is an important real-world tip if you're considering setting up a cluster, a real application cluster environment. This is a verification tool that does some deep checking to make sure that the system is compatible and will work in a rack environment. So keep that in mind. In our case, we're going to run the setup.exe to invoke the Oracle Universal Installer on this machine. If you've already installed Oracle Database, then you're familiar with the OUI and how it works. On the left, we have a nice detailed table of contents that shows us in advance where we are in the process and what's upcoming. On this first page, if we have My Oracle Support credentials, which we would have if we have an agreement with Oracle, we could supply that, and this gives us transparent software updating. Because I downloaded this as essentially an evaluation, I have no choice but to skip the software updates. This is an important page. This is asking us what kind of installation we're doing. We have Install and Configure Grid Infrastructure for a cluster. That would be the option we want to take if we want this box to serve as a node in a rack cluster. Install and configure grid infrastructure for a standalone server. This is actually what we want because we're just going to install the ASM bits on this machine and it's not going to participate in a cluster. Third choice is to upgrade grid infrastructure or Oracle Storage Management. And I've told you this before, this little help guy, if you hover over it, it'll give you some additional info. And it says that if we're using 10G or 11G, we can upgrade those grid bits to 12C by going on this path. And then finally, we can just lay down the bits but not do any configuration. And I don't want that. I want the second option for standalone server, and then we'll click Next. I'll accept the language. And this is important. This is where we can create our first disk group. This disk group will take the name data by default. I'm going to add a 1 to that. You specify a redundancy type, high, normal, or external. I'm going to choose normal. You can choose an allocation unit size, and again, the little helps are useful. It says do not exceed 64 meg, so the allocation unit in the stripes, etc. will be 1 meg. And it says add disks, candidate disks, and there's nothing there. Well, we should take a peek, actually. Probably should have done this before kicking open the OUI, but you learn something new every day, right? We need to peek at the disk subsystem of this box. So let me do a run disk mgmt.msc to open the disk management console, and it sees that I have 4 disks that I've attached to this virtual machine. I've not initialized them. I'm going to initialize them using MBR. If these were really big disks over 4 terabytes, actually 2 terabytes according to Microsoft, we could do the GUID partition table, but they're not. They're tiny little disks. So the old-fashioned master boot record is good enough. Let me spread this guy out, and you see we have these 4 new disks. They're showing up as online. They've been initialized, but this is not the status that we need them to be in. We actually need to create a volume. So let's right-click, New Simple Volume, and we'll step through this wizard. It's important that we do not assign a drive letter or drive path, and it's also important that we do not format this volume. And notice that it shows up as a raw partition. So I need to do this for the other 3. I'm actually going to pause the video so you don't have to watch it. Kind of boring. Okay, so we have our 4 disks here. They're showing up as raw in the disk management console. That's cool. What we need to do in order to get candidate disks visible in this window is stamp the disks. And stamping is essentially a way to hand over disks to Oracle. And Oracle will put its quote-unquote stamp on them and identify these are my disks. So let's click Stamp Disk, Add or Change Label. It did detect those 4 devices that I just brought online, so I'm going to click one, hold down Shift, click the last one to select all 4, and then the stamps, you have some ability to customize the prefix. I'm going to make that Data 1, click Next. Not going to edit, I'll just leave them alone, click Next, and Finish to bring those in. So now I have 4 disks available as candidate disks, and I'm only going to grab 2 in this case because later I might want to come back and create another disk group using the Configuration Assistant or the CMD tool. We'll click Next. And you'll notice that because Grid Infrastructure is a separate instance, you have separate administrative accounts, sys and ASM SNMP. I'm going to choose the same password for both. Best practice would be to choose separate passwords, but this is a dev box, so it's not that big of a deal. We have environment variables for Oracle Base and the Oracle Home for this instance. It's going to pick up App Grid Administrator. I'm actually going to browse to drive C, App, Oracle. I'll make that my base. After all, I do have an instance of the database already on this machine. And once you do that, the Oracle Home for Grid gets tucked under the appropriate Optimal Flexible Architecture or OFC path. So let's click Next. Insufficient disk space on this volume. Interesting. Let me change the drive letter to F and see if there's enough space on there. Yep, there was. The prerequisite checker is giving me a ding about temp space on my system volume. It must really be low. And notice that I can't proceed. I either have to fix this and check again, or I can ignore and just steamroll through. And if you do decide to steamroll through, you get a warning. And that's fine on my development environment. We have a summary screen, and we can save this out as a response file if we want to perform a scripted install on other machines, let's say. And then we can install to actually run through and finish it out.